We are very excited to turn our attention to our second panel, which is going to be about the human toll living with transnational repression. And we're pleased to have Dr. Jeff Rogg here to moderate this panel. Dr. Rogg recently joined, have you even started with us yet? Or
Next Friday.
Next Friday. He's so excited. He don't even work for us
That's
yet.
right.
He's jumping in here and doing this. So Jeff's going to do a great job with this. We're really excited to have him on board too. But he's just getting ready to join GNSI as a resident senior research fellow. Before coming to us, he was an assistant professor at the Joint Special Operations University. Also served as assistant professor in the Department of Intelligence and Security Studies at the Citadel, as well as postdoctoral teaching and research fellow in the National Security Affairs Department at the U.S. Naval War College. Dr. Rogg's work has appeared in the International Journal of Intelligence and Counterintelligence, the Washington Post, the National Interest, and the Los Angeles Times. I will now turn the discussion over to Dr. Rogg, who will introduce the panelists, facilitate the discussion, and lead the Q&A session that follows. Jeff, over to you.
Thank you very much, Jim. I have big shoes to fill, just so you all know. We're missing one panelist, regrettably. Sarah Tyke couldn't be here, and also Amy Mitchell, who did a lot to really help this event come to pass. And I should also mention, if the subject interests you, Amy and our own Sarah Brown wrote a decision brief, GNSI decision brief, which is one of our signature analytical products at GNSI on the topic of transnational repression. So I'd encourage you all to look at the website and read the decision brief. With that, I'm delighted to welcome our panelists. You know, one interesting thing about national security is sometimes we have these events and we talk about the issues in a vacuum without actually showing the human dimension. So one of the great things about this particular event that we've had today is you're seeing the human dimension of a national security problem. So with that, first, I'll introduce Frances Hui. Frances Hui was the first Hong Kong activist to receive asylum in the United States. At the early age of 13, she started her involvement in Hong Kong's social movements. She was a former standing committee member of Scholarism and a campaigner for multiple pro-democracy candidates in Hong Kong. During the subsequent 2019 to 2020 protests, she briefed US officials on the plight of Hong Kongers and organized global solidarity rallies with allies in support of freedom and democracy in Hong Kong. After the imposition of the national security law in 2020, she sought asylum in the United States. She is currently based in Washington, D.C., and she continues her advocacy with the Committee for Freedom in Hong Kong Foundation and other communities that are oppressed by the CCP. She also heads the organization We the Hong Kongers, dedicated to promoting and strengthening the culture and identity of Hong Kongers abroad. Because of her activism in December 2023, Hong Kong authorities placed a $1 million, that's in Hong Kong dollars, bounty on her head for violating the national security law. I'd also like to introduce Ziba Murat. Ziba was born in Xinjiang and came to the United States in the summer of 2005. She spent her youth in Urumqi, the region's capital, and she went to high school there. In the US, she graduated from the Virginia Commonwealth University in Richmond, Virginia, and now lives in Tampa, Florida, which incidentally is also my hometown and home to GNSI. Ziba is an advocate for the wrongfully imprisoned family members of Uyghur Americans and is also an outspoken critic of the CCP. She continues to advocate on behalf of her mother, who was taken in Xinjiang in 2018 and remains hostage at the hands of the CCP to this day. She has appeared on various panels and briefings with government officials and elements of civil society, and she also works closely with diplomatic missions and working groups at the United Nations. She frequently speaks to journalists, students, government officials on her mother's case and the plight of Uyghur Americans whose family members are arbitrarily detained in Xinjiang. So with that, I'd like to give our panelists about 5 to 10 minutes, and then we're going to have plenty of time for Q&A. And as Jim mentioned, please do make your way to the microphone and ask a question. So with that, Ziba, would you like to start?
I am both honored and saddened to be here today. I'm sad that appearing on these platforms has become a normal for me in my life. I was forced to become an advocate, to speak out as the only hope for saving my mother since the Chinese government took my mother, Dr. Gulshan Abbas, hostage. September 2018 was the last time I spoke to her. I still remember the night I said goodnight to her before I went to bed. The next day, I tried to contact her as I usually do because I speak to her almost every day. I messaged her, I called her, no answer. Just imagine waking up one day and the person you talk to every day just stopped responding to you. In this case, this is my mother. She just vanished without any warning. But this was not a coincidence, as it happened 6 days after her sister, Rushan Abbas, spoke at a panel hosted by Hudson Institute. She talked about the camps and the mass detention, and 6 days after, my mother vanished. My mom's last visit to US was 2016. When we heard the whispers of horror taking place in the Uyghur homeland, I begged her to stay. But she refused. I still remember the smile on her face when she told me, I have done nothing wrong. I have no fear. I will be okay. So I sent her through the security at the airport. She went back home in Turumchi, and she didn't return as she promised she would. I never thought this would be such a long separation. 3 months after I welcomed my own child, my mother vanished, ripped away from us. This pain I have been compounded over multiple years of battle for human rights, human dignity that my mother deserves. Mother is a retired medical doctor. She's a grandma of 3. She spends decades helping others as a physician, healing them. She's the least political person I've ever seen in my life. But Beijing can see past her ethnicity, her bloodline, her relatives, and because of this, she was taken from us and given a prison sentence on the fabricated, baseless charges. Her abduction is a direct retribution for her sister's activism here in the United States. The CCP's cruel act of reprisal, taking my mom as a form of kin punishment, to inflict emotional pain through this unjust separation of family members. It is solely to silence her sister here in America for exercising her freedom of speech on American soil. Uyghurs in diaspora are living in a torment, having to face the torture of no news or hearing news of far from family member passing. Every time this happens, it sends a ripple fear throughout the community. And this fear of repercussion has been used to attempt to keep us silent about the pain and torment we are living every day. The targeting of our families has caused immense distress and torment within the community. These are stories of harassment, arbitrary detention, forced disappearances, all meant to exert pressure on us to deter any attempts to expose the truth about the atrocity being committed against the Uyghurs. It is imperative that international community understands the gravity of the threat faced by the Uyghur diaspora and to support and amplify those courageous voices. By showing solidarity through a meaningful, real solution, we can collectively send powerful message to Beijing that at least the United States government stands with its citizens. They care about our well-being and safety. We need real solutions. Continuing to allow the Chinese government to stonewall, harass, silence only results in another day of victims, like my own mother, languishes in the prison camp, and for the relatives live here in fear. My mother's case is just one of too many. Only through consistent and unwavering efforts can we make a difference in the lives of those who are affected by the transnational repression and bring an end to this cycle of suffering. Lastly, I know the Chinese government is watching this because they always do. And I have one message only. Release my mother.
Thank you very much, Ziba. Francis.
Thank you, Jeff, for the introduction, and thank you, Ziba, for your courage to speak up. Actually, last night I was preparing for this remarks. I was told that we got 5 minutes, and as soon as I realized, I was typing, and as soon as I realized, I found out that I have already gone over that limit because there's so much that we could share. There's so many experiences of transnational repression, and as Ziba said, these kind of conferences has become almost daily for us. Like, I didn't choose this life to be an advocate and to give up my previous passion, but the fact that we wanted to, speak the truth and to stand up for our home and fight for freedom has become a cause and become something that, so expensive that we have to put our lives and even the safety of our own and our family, our loved ones, on jeopardy. I think what we have just said in the past that the CCP is carrying out the most sophisticated campaign of transnational repression everywhere. And today I wanted to share some of my personal experience, and then I will share a little bit more what I have been doing in Washington to counter those efforts by the CCP. Since the early days when I was a student in Boston, I have encountered both physical and online death threats, harassment, and stalking, including being followed by unknown agency to my home and be photographed on the streets. I had held rallies in Boston knowing that some people have threatened to shoot me in the face. Even though I informed the local authorities ahead of the rally, and after I found out that I was being followed, no one was held accountable. I actually watched the man who followed me just walk away from the police officer after they had some talks. And I think it's fitting for me to share more about what happened at school as well. I remember I gave a presentation in one of my classes about the concentration camps in Xinjiang and in East Turkestan. I think back in the days, it was like 2018 when the world started to realize that there are camps in the area. And so I gave a presentation in my class, and what happened was Chinese students in the class stood up in protesting against it. They didn't plan for it, but they truly think that it was a propaganda, and they protest against it. They walk out from the classroom, and the professor simply didn't know how to react to it. And I felt like in that environment, a lot of the classmates were also shocked too. They didn't know who was right, and both parties were emotional. But then at the same time, I felt like my freedom to share what I know has been taken away. And other classmates who have opinions about it, there are Taiwanese students in the class that they also knew about it. They also felt threatened and not free enough to speak up on this issue just simply because of the reaction of the Chinese students in the same place. And back to what happened to me in Boston in those rallies. Actually, in May 2023, the Department of Justice indicted one of the Chinese agents who were tasked with spying on my activities for allegedly acting as an agent of China. And in the full indictment, I learned that at multiple events I organized, the Chinese American citizen took pictures and videos of me and sent them directly back to Beijing officials. Although I think it was great that to see that the US was taking legal actions to this man, it was also important to note that there were other agents involved in this who found the delayed of actions by the US as an opportunity to get away from it simply by leaving the country. And in fact, this is a tactic used by China and perhaps a lot of other countries as well. They first sent someone out to work on a mission, then they swap them back with someone new so that we will never be able to be fast enough to get them with our existing mechanism. That's one of the problems we have in our system. And last year, the Hong Kong authorities issued arrest warrants and $1 million bounty for the arrest of 13 overseas Hong Kongers, including myself. 5 of the people are living in the US. And ever since that, the death threats I've received have been unstoppable. Some of our immediate family members and even in-laws in Hong Kong have been detained for questioning and were used as a means to pass on threatening messages to us. The CCP has long used this tactic to intimidate and silence dissidents abroad. I think Ziba has already mentioned it, and Jur also mentioned that in her story, is that this is one of the things that they do to intimidate and silence us, and we're now seeing that happening to the Hong Kong pro-democracy activists. And earlier in the morning, we talked about the Chinese secret police stations scattered around all the world, and we know that there are at least 5 of them that are located in the US. But you probably have never heard of the Hong Kong Economic and Trade Offices that are actually equally dangerous as the Chinese embassies and those secret police stations. The HKETOs are outposts of the Hong Kong government to boost Hong Kong's trade and economic exchanges overseas. They have 3 locations in the US, including Washington, D.C., New York, and San Francisco. And they're granted diplomatic immunities in the US on the basis that Hong Kong was considered an autonomous region separate from the PRC system. And even though the last administration has declared otherwise after the imposition of the national security law, China continues to enjoy 2 diplomatic representations in the US through the HKATO. Here is why this office is diplomatic. It's problematic. We know that not only they have been actively working with big lobbying firms to influence American policies on Hong Kong and China, but they're also exerting repression on overseas Hong Kongers on foreign soil. Just 2 days ago, the UK put charges on 3 men for assisting Hong Kong's intelligence service and foreign interference. One of them is an office manager at London's HKETO, while the 2 other people were paid by the HKETO, all of whom have been working together to stalk at least 3 activists who were wanted by the Hong Kong government. This has further illustrated the extent of Hong Kong authorities' transnational repression and the pressing need for all governments to shut down their HKETOs in their countries. And who knows, I know for a fact that even though I don't have concrete evidence at this point, I know for a fact that HKETO in the US is looking after us. And there are actually reports done by other organizations showing that they have actively trying to find out the whereabouts of activists here in the US. And so this is why me and my colleagues at the Committee for Freedom in Hong Kong Foundation and other Hong Kong advocates have been working relentlessly in Washington, D.C. to call on the US government to counter transnational repression by defining the consequences of carrying out such acts. Currently, there are 2 bills in Congress that are relevant to address the problem happened in my personal experience. I know my time is up, but I'm happy to discuss more in depth later on during our discussion. But I wanted to underscore what many panelists in this event have already mentioned earlier, which is the fact that the issue of transnational repression should not be singled out and sidelined as a human rights issue. It is a national security issue that threatens territorial sovereignty of other nations and puts every single one of us who are attending this event at risk, right? We all know that the CCP is watching this event. They know that all of the dissidents that they want are sitting right here speaking in front of you, and obviously they're watching it. And so it is crucial that the US has to step up with stronger and more robust response efforts to counter this. And I'm thrilled to see this event taking place, and I know that this is the last panel of the day, but I'm eager to continue to explore more solutions and options for us to move forward and to tackle this issue more thoroughly.
Thank you so much, Frances.
Thank you.
So 2 pretty powerful personal testimonies so far. As you make your way to the microphone, and please do with questions, I suppose I'll start with, so one problem in American national security, and I think GNSI is trying to actually bridge this, is sometimes these questions and these national security issues are too removed from the American people themselves. So they're still the province of academia or industry or government. But when it comes to China, William M. Vanina, who was major counterintelligence official in the United States, put out an alarming statistic that the CCP has collected personal data on roughly 80% of Americans. So if we look in this room, 80% of us. Based on both of your personal experiences and your familiarity with the CCP, do you think that everyday Americans, so members of this audience, for instance, have something to worry about? In your cases, certainly, but just for the rest of us who China may be collecting information about us, do you think they'll harness that information somehow towards, we talked about control of the body, control of the mind, control of society?
Well, I think absolutely. I'm sure everyone here has social media, and although they're not all of them owned by Chinese government. I mean, if you have TikTok, that's another story. But we know that bots are everywhere and on the social media. And I mentioned about the online threats that I have gotten. Sometimes you just never know whether this is a real person that are commented under your post. And I remember, I mean, after I got the bounty, or even before that, I would get thousands of comments under a post that gone viral and on my social media. And it's because it's about the Chinese government. I would always get those comments, whether it's real people or not. And it's sad to say that we have gotten used to it. We have gotten used to those threats and kind of like turn a blind eyes to a lot of these because we just simply don't know if they are real. And I think I don't have the numbers of how 80% or whatever data is gotten have sent to the Chinese government, but I know for a fact that they are all around the internet. And some of my colleagues who just joined our organization have already gotten some security problem with their phone, like weird phone calls and messages, and it we try to find out what's happening, but this is what happens when you join an organization that does Hong Kong work and Uyghur work. This is the kind of things that you have to encounter every day. And I think also out of just beyond the digital security, we talk about, biotech stuff like, DNAs. China is actually they're trying to find out ways to inroads to get their biotech companies to get into the US. And they're actually doing stuff to get DNA genetic stuff, data here in order to help their genocide in East Turkestan and on Tibetans. And we know for a fact there are a lot of reports on that, that these biotech companies are doing that in the US. And they continue to, get DNA and genetic information from other people like pregnant women and stuff to help them in their research with PLA. And actually right now in Congress, there is a bill called the Biosecure Act, which is trying to, prohibit federal contribution to these companies. And I think it's great that our, Congress is looking into this issue, and there are so much more that we have to look after. I think, we again, this is not just a human rights issue. It's all within our own system and affecting national security everywhere.
Just to add Francis's points, so the phone number is pretty it's a personal thing for us, but from what we're seeing in our communities, all these harassment, all these pressure is coming through from that phone number, from the call. They call you and pressure you not to speak, not to go to these events. They get these phone number either pressuring your relatives back in home, or to they have some way to get those personal information. So I believe when you say we're affected, everybody is in the room is affected, has some sort of national security. Also, this will connect to the safety of American citizens that we're living here in this country.
And not trying to scare everyone to tell, to give you guys, a sense of fear, but it's important to know that there is, some risk of doing this. And the fact that all of these activists are speaking in front of you, and we know that the risk that we're taking, and we still decide to stand here and speak, is because we know that this is their tactic to silence us. And if we choose not to speak today, then we fall into their trap. And again, we don't want that. And so we're here to warn what's going to happen to the rest of Americans, so that you don't have to deal with that. But it's important for us to know what's, the human toll behind all of these.
Thank you, Francis. Yes, please. And same protocol as before, please state your name and affiliation and question. Thank you.
Hi. Thank you, Laura with Safeguard Defenders. Thank you so much to both of you for sharing your story. Francis, you hinted at the end about 2 bills that were pending that you thought were relevant to your situation. I wondered if you could expand on that a bit, but also, obviously we've seen a growing number of criminal investigations and prosecutions, and I guess we all feel there's never enough of them. But I was wondering, beyond the criminal elements, from your perspective, both of you, what are the kind of measures you'd be looking at in terms of policy responses,
Mhm.
both to counter things that are happening in China, where obviously governments outside have very little, say over what do you want to see them do, but also inside our countries, things that go beyond the criminal domain, be it psychosocial support, anything that can kind of build up the resilience of these targeted communities. Just your thoughts on those things. Thanks.
Yeah, and I remember, earlier in your panel, you mentioned that the U.S. is actually leading in the efforts of countering these efforts compared to a lot of the European countries, and a lot of the democratic allies are looking at the U.S. As they are finding solutions to counter that. I agree with that, and I think that we are seeing growing attention to this issue. And although we always think that there are a lot that can be done, and so it's important we have these kind of discussions. On your question about the two bills that I mentioned, the first one I want to mention is the Transnational Repression Policy Act. The bill basically requires the president to impose property and visa blocking sanctions on certain foreign individuals and entities that directly engage in transnational repression. It was introduced, it's led by the Congressional Executive Commission on China, who have been leading a lot of the China-related work, advocacy. And the bill also requires the Department of Justice to develop a strategy to promote initiatives that enhance international awareness of transnational repression and provide trainings to relevant federal employees and law enforcement partners. A lot of what this bill has done, is trying to do is pretty much in line with a lot of what human rights advocates in the human rights field have been asking for. More trainings to law enforcement agencies and kind of developing a common knowledge about transnational repression. In my experience, I mentioned in my story that when those kind of things came up, my professor didn't know how to deal with it. The school administrators didn't know how to deal with it. I got death threats from a student at my school. I know who that is. I know his name. And he sent me death threats simply because I wrote an article about my identity of being a Hong Konger and the difference between China and Hong Kong. And I brought it up to the school administrations. And I mean, I didn't actually bring it up because the threat was so widespread among the Chinese community that they were really upset, and then they went to the offices of international students trying to exert their anger and their frustration. And so the school reached out to me and tried to make a deal with me, and that was like 2018 or 2019, and that student didn't get any consequence for sending me those death threats. And it was really frustrating. I felt like I was being isolated because no one was helping me. And so I think there needs to be more education and training, not only with local law enforcement, but also, schools administration. They need to know what's happening, to what is going to happen in the Chinese diaspora, what is going to happen to Hong Kongers at their school, Taiwanese, Uyghurs, and Tibetans. These are things that they would have to deal with. And actually, after 2019, we're seeing more and more students that are the receiving ends of these threats. And all of those are acts of transnational repression. And I don't think this term has come to everyone's understanding until very recently. And I'm sure a lot of the colleges, this is a new idea to them. And so how are they going to deal with that? There is some kind of education and a generalized, standardized education that needs to be provided to these educational institutions, in my opinion. Second, the bill, another bill that I talked about is the Hong Kong Economic and Trade Offices Certification Act. It basically requires the president to determine whether the HKETO still merits receiving the diplomatic immunities and privileges that was provided under the International Organizations Immunities Act. And so if it's determined that they do not merit those privileges, the HKETO basically have to be shut down in the US. And that's basically what we are aiming for. And what happened in the UK 2 days ago is exactly, a clear evidence that they are involved in acts of transnational repression and going after dissidents abroad. And so the bill right now has passed the House Foreign Relations Committee, but it is facing a bit of difficulties in getting to a floor because there were some concerns of revenue generation, which we found was a false claim. It has nothing to do with revenues, and so we're still unsure why the hold-up, what caused the hold-up. But we also know that the administration is very reluctant to act on this issue related to the Hong Kong, the HKETO. So we pretty much have to rely on the Congress to act on this and to put pressure on the administration to work on, the problem with HKETO. And, HKETO is everywhere. They have locations in Europe, in the UK, in the US, everywhere around the world. So it's not just an issue in the US. I think if we get to pass this law in the US, we would be able to see more movement in other places, in other countries, to look into their HKETOs as well. Yeah.
Thank you. Go ahead, sir.
Thank you very much for each of your presentations. Can you hear me okay? Is this mic adequate? The 13 or 20 or 27 countries that have been most helpful to China with respect to this repression, from Nepal to Serbia to United Arab Emirates, Egypt, India, primary examples, would it be overkill, or would it be appropriate for the United States to try sanctions with respect to those 13 countries, although it's been relatively unsuccessful with Russia with respect to Ukraine and Iran? However, those sanctions have worked in some cases. Do you think that those 13 countries should be sanctioned for allowing the Communist Party to interfere in the lives of the citizens of those countries with respect to effectuating this repression within their borders through their own officials?
Well, thank you for your question. I think there are a lot that goes into these diplomatic exchange with other countries, and I can't say that this would be, the perfect solution. This would take a lot of talking within the State Department to handle that. But I think what we are doing right now is to continue to have more multilateral conversation with other allies, and hopefully that they can also help us in the conversations with the 13 countries that you mentioned. I think the UN is one of kind of the stomping ground for that kind of issue. And we actually have been seeing a trend that some of the countries that have been siding with China in the past, they're slowly moving to our direction. And although it's not like a really impressive, there must be more that can be done. And obviously advocates have been very frustrated with how irresponsible they are. But I do see there is a trend of moving toward our direction. And what we can do is to continue to raise awareness out of, as human rights advocates, to continue to raise awareness in the public, and to make sure that we get our message right, and to counter the propaganda that CCP is putting out. Yeah.
So in the interim, too, as the audience thinks of more questions, these opportunities are fairly rare also to talk about what in intel studies they would call a hard target country, a repressive and closed regime like China's. Ziba, one question that I had is one of the pretexts that the CCP uses for repression of Uyghurs is that it's a counterterrorism operation, which obviously resonates with the United States. And so a danger in that is you don't really see a lot of activism from the Organization of the Islamic Conference, for instance, and other Muslim states. However, Al-Qaeda has targeted the Uyghurs and said, and don't forget about the Uyghurs who are being oppressed by China. Could you perhaps speak to, just for general audience awareness, do you think that there's a concern that the Uyghurs will be radicalized, or that there's although some Uyghurs have been found to train in Pakistani camps, and there have been Uyghurs who have been associated with terrorist organizations, though, could you just speak to the Uyghur people as far as, is this a threat that Americans should take seriously when China says it, or is this just a pretext?
I'm not really aware of that side of the things, but I can tell you is from my own experience. My mother's case. She's a doctor. She's a retired medical doctor. She's 60 years old. The charges that they have on her is terrorism. So you can see that, this terrorism concept is a blanket concept that they're handing to everybody back home. So basically, they just give you the sentencing and say, you need to sign this or otherwise you're going to suffer. So I wanted to reiterate that this mass detention is, first of all, it's not okay. I mean, we are every day, we're just normal people. I never in my life would thought about that my mother would be in jail because of terrorism. So this is, you can see from that how ridiculous the whole thing behind this mass arrest and mass detention. I'll just leave it.
Can I add on that note? It's actually, you see there is a commonality there is in Hong Kong, I'm also being called as a terrorist. And can you imagine two of the people sitting right in, do we look like a terrorist? No. But that's something that they would use to label us and describe us. And they use those labels to undermine the legitimacy of people and to basically shut them down. But I know no one is going to fall for that, but this is how they are going to label us. And so it's also important that we understand that this is what they are using to basically undermine our work. But also, actually, I wanted to flag a report that I have done recently, which is also available outside on the table for free. It's called The Hostile Takeover, the CCP and the Hong Kong Religious Communities. And throughout my research, that examines the talk about the religious freedom in Hong Kong and how the CCP is slowly taking over that realm. I found that actually Muslim communities in Hong Kong are also being utilized, being politicized to advance Chinese, their propaganda on Uyghur Muslims. For instance, there was one time that the Muslim leaders in Hong Kong had a trip to East Turkestan, to the Xinjiang region, and they took interviews on state TVs basically saying that, there's no genocide, we don't see any camps, and people have been living really quite peacefully and they're making a happy life here. And all of that, what they're trying to do is to use people with a Muslim face, Muslim leaders to speak on behalf of the rest of the Uyghur population to testify that there is no such thing. These are Western propaganda. And so we see that the Muslim community in Hong Kong is already being used to politicize and being politicized and being used to advance the agenda of the CCP. And this is what I think the same thing applies to a lot of other Muslim, Islamic countries. A lot of the leaders, they're shutting their mouth and they're not talking about the issue happening in East Turkestan. And there is a lot of benefit that goes into it that also ties into the Belt and Road initiatives. And so if you're interested to know more about that, you can go grab, a copy of the report, and it talks more in depth about this issue in Hong Kong. Yep.
Yes, sir.
Dean Baxendale again from Toronto. Just actually on the point on the terrorism, of course, after 9/11, the Chinese Communist Party used that as a weapon, and ultimately within newspapers, academic circles started to promote this idea. utilizing effectively this idea that Uyghurs were terrorists, separatists, etc. That goes to the targeting of dissidents like Dolkan Issa, who had a red notice for him being a terrorist, a murderer, etc. So we shouldn't be we should not get caught up in the Chinese propaganda, and we also have to look at Beijing adjacent think tanks inside the United States who have been receiving funding for years to either have neutral or pro-Beijing stances, especially when it comes integrating with trade, et cetera, because it's always a win-win. But these two brave women who are up here right now, they speak truth to power. And they are the leaders in terms of bringing forward what many Americans are afraid to do, which is that this is a right, the human rights agenda of the Chinese Communist Party targeted against Uyghurs, Tibetans, Mongolians, the Falun Gong, Hong Kongers. They're actually representing the faith in humanity and our freedom and democracy. If we lose Xinjiang and that human rights battle, I think we lose democracy. But I just wanted, the question I have, I know both of you have faced great emotional toll on both of you, on your families, et cetera. As you know, I've worked with 4 of the 8 original targeted dissidents from Hong Kong. How are you coping with this? And what kind of guidance can you give to others who are advocating on behalf of the various oppressed groups and minorities from China in keeping on and pursuing human rights?
Well, for me personally, this has been extremely, extremely painful. Because of the way that this happened, I had a newly born baby. She was 3 months old, and then my mother vanished. So in between, caring for a newborn and having to look for my own mother is traumatic. But it's hard. Believe me when I said it's hard, because I live in this and I'm still living in this, but we cannot lose hope. The only thing we have, the Uyghur community have right now, is just to cling on to that hope that we will see our family one day. And we have to speak out for them because we are their voice. They don't have anybody else. We're living in the free country, and honestly, sometimes I feel so guilty just to live my life when my mom is suffering in prison. But what keeps me going is my 6-year-old little daughter. And when I think about my mom, I think about her, jokes, her food, the conversation we have, and the time that we spend together. And that keeps me going. I said, I will get you out. You have to come live with us. And my daughter's now 6 years old. She started to, noticing the absence of her grandmother in our life, because I talk about her all the time, normal. But she doesn't know what is going on, why she's not here with us. And just recently, I was taking her to school, and she, out of the blue, we have not had a conversation about my mom prior days, or out of the blue, in the back of the car, she just looks at me and say, "Why can't you make a passport for her? Why can't she come here?" And I don't know how to answer that question, because I don't know the best way to tell her, your grandma is taken by the Chinese government because she's related to us who are living in the United States. At that time, I realized the importance of taking her to those events when it's appropriate, so I can tell her, I am meeting with these people. I'm doing this so we can bring your grandma here with us so she can live with us. That way, I don't feel guilty to leave her and house at home so often to do these advocacy works. It's hard. We have to do this because we have to. And you cannot do this alone. This is the other thing. For me personally, when I do those advocacy work, I meet lots of people. I tell people the only good thing that came out from this whole horrible situation is I met so many good people. There's so many people that's there, show solidarity, that they're there with you So rely on those people.
I think, what Ziba is experiencing, it's 10 times more painful than I'm experiencing. But I think, this is very new to the Hong Kong community, right? Like it only happened in the past, 3 years ago when the national security laws was implemented. And I only left Hong Kong in 2020. And so if you asked me for advice, I would say I'm not so good at it. Like, work-life balance and all that kind of thing. I work almost 10 hours on Hong Kong, and I wake up and I do and then I go to bed. That's all I do every day. And you get burnt out really easily. And a lot of times what drives you is actually the survivor skills. Knowing that a lot of my friends who I know, I grew up with in my childhood, they're either in jail or in exile. I try to write to them, but I know that some of my letters wouldn't go through because the prison guard would stop them. And some of them I have been contacting, they probably don't even know it's me because I can't write my name on there. And so it's really hard that you have friends in jail and you're not able to really talk to them normally. And I don't talk to my family at all right now. I don't know what they're doing. How are they doing? Because again, it's irresponsible for me to continue to contact them and to put them at risk. And we know what happened to them when I got the bounty issued on my head. And so the only thing that I have to do as a daughter is to stay away from them. And it's painful. To not talk to your friends and your family. And some of my friends also unfriend me. And I don't blame them because, that's what they can have to do to protect themselves. And so I think a lot of times it's the mindset of trusting these people and knowing that they don't do these things because they hate you, but simply because that they also need to survive in their own way. And what really ties us all together is the hope. Again, it's the notion of hope. And although what's happening in Hong Kong has not, we know that things are worsening in Hong Kong, but it's not helpful for us to say like, oh yeah, like nothing is gonna go better, so we're just gonna live a life here, like build a life here and ignore all this information. Like that's simply not helpful. And I think it's my responsibility to speak up for people who are oppressed. I always want to say like, I'm voicing out not because they're voiceless. People do have a voice, but they're oppressed, they're silenced. And so this is why I'm here. I have the freedom. I left Hong Kong and I have the freedom now to speak up. And so I understand some of the people in the community, they would be scared to speak up, even though they are out here. But I think they also need to see some faces, people who are willing to speak up, to continue to be inspired by them and to see us as, one of their voice, one of their representation. And we're here and we're willing to take that role. We're not hero. I think heroes are the people who stayed in Hong Kong and continue to fight in their own way. And so what we're here is to try to amplify their voice and make sure that this issue doesn't go away, doesn't get forgotten.
So Jason Walker at Eckerd and USF St. Pete. When we think of terrorism, we think of tactics like hostage taking, blackmailing, to achieve political ends. So am I crazy, or am I wrong to think that there's some degree of projection that might be going on the part of the CCP when they make charges like terrorism against people? Because it kind of seems like that's what they're doing.
Could you reframe the question for them?
The charge of terrorism, it seems like, to me, it just seems interesting. They seem to be charging people, like retired medical doctors, with crimes like terrorism. But it seems like what actual terrorism is taking hostages, arresting people, taking hostages, blackmailing people, surveilling them, threatening them. Am I wrong to think that this is projection on the part of the Communist Party?
I think this will go back to what Jeff had said in the earlier panel. Their laws keep changing to fit their narratives, right? They just do whatever they wanted to. They want to please change it, because I think I'm not a law expert, but I think when you charge people with the terrorism, there's a certain thing that you don't have to disclose, like, sentencing or court document, blah, blah, blah. So that will feed back to that. Because for my mom, we didn't know where she was until 4 years after she disappeared. We didn't even know, she just vanished. So we still don't see any documents, court proceedings, nothing. She's just been held there as a hostage. So it goes back to the law that they have in their own scope. This is okay to do because we have a law for this.
So that one of the gentlemen earlier mentioned that it's a very difficult thing to do, but useful in national security is to put yourself in the shoes of the other party. And so this kind of goes to the op-ed question. The way I'm listening to your stories, I'm trying to take in the whole event. And so there's something obviously that China fears in the democracy movement. There's something they fear about having the large Uyghur population in what is the largest territory of China that's connected to a really important economic corridor they're trying to establish. And the way you change states' behavior is show them that it's in their interest to change, either through compulsion or through, carrots and sticks, basically. So how would you address, this is again to reframe the Xi Jinping question, we've talked about sanctions, we've talked about boycotts in a way. How can we address Chinese interests in a way that might change their behavior as far as their fear of a large Uyghur minority? The accusation of terrorism, which you pointed out, Ziba, is misplaced. Francis, to your point, Hong Kong was supposed to have one country, two systems for 50 years to preserve the sort of British capitalist system that had been in place, and it didn't last 20 years. So is there a way that you could address Chinese interests to try and change their behavior through vehicles other than, I guess, the sticks approach that we've mainly focused on here? Reassure them, and still, is Xinjiang, does it want to be a complete separate entity? Or is there a way that you could, that again, address Xi Jinping or say the Chinese official in the room who would say, but we need to do this because of X, Y, and Z?
Well, I think first of all that they have to know people are paying attention. We have to, address these issues. These issues need to be agenda in the Congress. Like, everybody should talk about it, so that they know, okay, so this is not just a US thing, it needs to be a whole coalition, like other countries, like-minded. So I think that's one way of addressing that. And also, Congress is really important because that will be a platform for us, like American citizens, hearings, roundtables. And we have, I think, there's a law already passed called Levinson Hostage Act, which mandates the White House hostage affair to negotiate on behalf of the American citizens held wrongfully abroad. But like for us, for American citizens like us, our family members is also wrongfully detained in China. That will give the mandate to the hostage affair to look into those cases, because I think there has to be a mechanism to address these cases, right? State Department, yes, they're doing what they can, but like they should be something that addresses the transnational repression side of things, because we are the country of the citizen and our families are suffering because they're related to us. So spotlight the cases or the issue is important.
I think taking Hong Kong as an example in the history, in 1997 when they had the deal, during the handover, which they promised that Hong Kong would basically operate on the principle of one country, two systems, where we can sustain and keep all the freedoms that we enjoy, and we can continue that capitalist lifestyle and the economy, and to be highly autonomous in our system. So we have our own court, we have our own law, and we have our own legislative council, our own government, which is also responsible to the Chinese government. All of these promises were broken, and from that you can also look into other things that they have promised to the world, and none of them have been kept up. China is a regime that doesn't keep up with its own promise. And so I don't know how I think the point here is not what we can do to feed into their interest to kind of resolve all these problems. It's more like they have to change their own behavior and to keep up with their promises that they're making to the world, right? And the reason why they can so blatantly break promises is because they also manipulated their own law, and they have manipulated the multilateral systems. They are all controlling the multilateral organizations. And so in the UN, they would have people who would vote against all the things that are brought up by Uyghur advocates. They would immediately be knocked down because they have other countries that are voting against those provisions. And so I think here what we're trying to do and what we should be looking into is that China has to change their behavior and to change their mindset of this Han Chinese concept, a homogenized concept that only Chinese people is running the Chinese government and all other ethnic groups have to be gone. I think some of the panelists have mentioned, it's the identity, it's the distinct identity that is stepping on their toes. But why? Right? Like in the US, we have so many different people in so many cultures and groups, and that doesn't take away what America is. So why China has to have this concept, right? And the only thing that we do is because we speak a different language, we speak Cantonese, we have a different mindset, we are pro-democracy and we fight for freedom, and that's threatening them. For them, it's a national threat. And so I don't think that there's anything we can do if China doesn't respect world order and doesn't respect and keep up with its own promises.
Jim, last question.
Jim Cardoso, GNSI. So I don't know the protocol of an MC asking a question, but I'm going to go for it. GNSI, we were founded to explore topics, explore issues, and try to get solutions in front of national policymakers so policy can change. We saw Senator Rubio spoke today, pre-recorded. Hopefully, we would like that potentially some of the proceeds from this conference, whether it's the written or maybe even these videos, get in front of these policymakers. If they were in this room, if Marco Rubio were in this room, or a U.S. and I'll concentrate on U.S. policymakers, they were in this room, what would you tell them?
We appreciate that this has been one of the really few issues that's in the Congress that's bipartisan. There's a lot of efforts, but we need real action. Those bills that's related to either Uyghurs or Hong Kongers, either in the Senate or House, we would like to see them pass because these will give resources and means for other agencies to tackle these issues. Yes, we have FBI to report those TNR cases, but the severity and urgency of this issue is the agency are not up to par. So that needs resources, and then I think those bills are the good starting point to have these issues addressed so the law enforcement can help us the way they're supposed to, and we as American citizens feel safe living in this country.
And I will add that we know that the China issue is quite bipartisan in Congress, but we also know that a lot of times these bills are getting held up because of party interests, like conflicts, interpersonal conflicts. And I mean, I would just tell them that, you gotta throw that all behind you. You can't just hold up these important bills, the Uyghur bill that Ziba talked about, the HKETO bills, the Sanctions Act, and the Transnational Repression Policy Act. All of these are impacting people like us every single day, and these bills are being held up simply because this congressman doesn't like the other member of Congress, and this member is signing on this bill, and so they don't want to sign on the same bill, right? And so I think, I would just tell them that, you need to really put yourself behind it, and if you introduce this bill, please put more efforts in pushing it. And I think, Ziba, I think you touched on one point that I want to mention is also, multilateral collaboration with other countries. Like the mechanism, we have the FBI, but we also know that a lot of the things that reported to the FBI just simply flew away. It's not being taken care of. We need a more streamlined mechanism for dissidents like us to be able to report to, and that for any emergency response that they're able to actually respond to these cases and these complaints and these reports and looked into it. I think, again, the US is obviously leading in this, but we need a more streamlined mechanism for us to tackle that more efficiently. Otherwise, the man is going to leave the country, like what happened to my case, the person who followed me. And I think to the audience here today, it's important that we support each other and to make sure if you know anyone who is experiencing transnational repression, don't just leave them. I mean, they always need they always have needs to that you could be helpful for. Make sure that they feel like they are having some support. And because I think when I got the bounty, what really kept me going is the community support. Everyone asking me, what do you need? Do you need a space? Do you want to talk about it? How do you feel about it? Do you need a place? Do you need a new home? Do you need to move? All of these things, these supports really kept me going. And as a community, I know this is, a policy dialogue. We wanted to find ways to recommend to our governments, but also individually, there are a lot of things that we can do simply by being a supportive friend and an ally to these victims of transnational repression is really important.
So before I turn it over to Jim, just editorializing, when you look at non-democratic regimes, authoritarian regimes, and repressive ones, and what they've tried to do throughout history, East Germany, Stasi, Romania, Securitate, some of the bravest people are the dissenters. And I know you said that the brave people are the people who are still staying over there, but to stand up to truly repressive regimes, and we have a tradition in the United States, we dissent, but it's very different here. So please join me in thanking our panelists for an excellent panel this afternoon.